Judaism is one of the world's religions, ranking only 11th in the number of followers. But it is also the progenitor of the two largest religions in the world, Christianity and Islam. Today we will talk about it and present 10 interesting facts about Judaism. The history of Judaism, according to the Bible, begins with a man named Abraham. He was a very old man who lived in Mesopotamia, this area of present-day Iraq, in those ancient days, that is, nearly 4,000 years ago. In that state, people worshipped various gods at the same time, including the god Zagon. He looks like a mermaid, only male. He has a human torso, arms, and head, but he also has a fish tail. Instead of legs, he also has the tail of a fish. But Abraham had a different idea of gods, or rather of God. He preferred the idea that in fact God is alone, the creator of all things. He has no equals. He is omnipotent and omniscient. This view of God's nature seems common now, but in those ancient times it was a very unusual idea. So one day God got in touch with Abraham and told him that if Abraham would obey God's instructions, he would become the father of a great nation. And he would also gain possession of a small country in which his descendants could live and prosper. God commanded Abraham to pack up his belongings, as well as his family and slaves, and go to Canaan, which is where the territory of Israel, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt is now for us. Abraham obeyed God and went there. Abraham was about 75 years old when he got there. The first thing he did was head for Egypt. He had a wife, Sarah, who was even older than he was. So he was afraid that because of her beauty, the Egyptians would kill him and take Sarah for themselves. So he arranged with his wife that they would all say that they were brother and sister. By the way, this was in fact the case. Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. That is, they had the same father, the Egyptian Pharaoh. Indeed, Pharaoh thought Sarah was very beautiful and took her as his wife, giving Abraham, as his brother, land and cattle in Egypt in return. She lived there for a while and all was well with him. But God did not like that Abraham gave up his wife. So God inflicted sickness on Pharaoh and his family. Pharaoh realized he had been deceived and gave Sarah back to Abraham and asked them to leave Egypt, which Abraham did, heading north into what is now Israel. Interestingly, many years later, the exact same situation happened to Abraham in another nation, and he again pretended to be his wife's brother. The king took her as his wife, and God intervened again, forcing the king to give Sarah back to Abraham. Abraham, by the way, had no children. His wife was barren, so she allowed him to have a child with her slave girl, which he did. He had a son named Ishmael, but then God promised Abraham that his wife Sarah, who was about 100 years old by then, would also bear him a child, and so it happened. The child was named Isaac, and Isaac then had 12 sons, each of whom became the founder of the clan or tribe from which the Jewish people later emerged. These Jews at some point ended up in slavery to the Egyptians and were in it for a long time. But then, one of them, named Moses, led the Jews out of Egyptian captivity under the leadership of God, performing various miracles in the process. When Moses came with his people to Mount Sinai, he received from God the 10 Commandments as well as the Torah, the holy writ of the Jews. This can be considered conventionally the beginning of Judaism. Eventually, the Jews established their own kingdom where modern Israel is. But then they were driven out of it by the invaders and taken into captivity once more, already to Babylon. Then they were freed and returned to Israel. But in the 70th year AD, they were driven out again by the Romans. Then the Jews began to settle all over Europe, Africa, and even Asia, and later America, constantly encountering hostility. At the same time, the Jews kept their traditions and religion, being in different parts of the world and forming local Jewish communities. As a result, there were many different streams of Judaism. The main points of these currents are common, but each has its own specifics and distinctive features. For example, language, appearance, and clothing, as well as interpretations of certain points in the scriptures. The scriptures are central to Judaism. The first of these is called the Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh. The Tanakh consists of 3 parts. The first part is the Torah itself, which God gave to the Jews at Mount Sinai. The other 2 sections were written later by the sages and prophets. The Hebrew Bible is much the same as what in Christianity is called the Old Testament. There are several sections in the Tanakh that are not in the Old Testament. Yet all of the most basic sections are the same. The interpretation of the Tanakh, especially the Torah, is a special process, as are the scriptures of other religions. The Bible can be interpreted in any way one wishes, putting any meaning into its lines. It can be interpreted literally, or it can be interpreted allegorically. For example, Some believe that the myth of Adam and Eve is literally the way it really was, while others interpret it as an allegory, that Adam is the embodiment of reason, and Eve is the embodiment of sensuality and emotion. Adam and Eve are like two sides of the same coin, shaping man. This is what the Jewish sages have been doing for millennia, developing their own special authorial methods of interpretation and gathering followers around them. These sages wrote another important sacred text in Judaism called the Talmud. This is a very large volume of text that has been written by Jewish sages over many centuries. The pages of the Talmud outline the moral and legal laws for Jews, explain and interpret certain provisions in the Torah, and even have disputes between different sages. That is, one sage in the Talmud comments on what was written by another sage a century ago and explains why he was wrong on the Tanakh. It is from the Talmud that one draws ideas about the right way to live in Judaism. Jews do not have large and opulent temples. Instead, they have synagogues. Often they look inconspicuous and may look like an ordinary house, unlike Christian churches or mosques, which usually have some characteristic exterior features, such as minarets or domes. But the interior furnishings of synagogues are always special. There is a special cabinet in which the Torah scrolls are kept. If a Jew has a Torah in his home, it is most likely in the form of a simple book. In a synagogue, however, the Torah is in the form of a large, long scroll that is read during ceremonies. Above the closet where the Torah is kept hangs a lamp with a fire that never goes out. It symbolizes the story of when the temple of the Jews ran out of oil thousands of years ago, but God made sure that the lamps did not go out for many days. There is also a sink in the synagogue where you can wash your hands before the service. Synagogues are divided into male and female sections so that men and women do not distract each other from God. A synagogue, however, is not a temple. Jews believe that a temple can only be built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, on the site of the temple that was there long ago but was destroyed. There is only one wall left of it, which we will talk about later. A synagogue is not a temple, but a place of public prayer. Synagogues are used for celebrations on the occasion of one's majority, for circumcision, which I will also talk about soon, as well as for other events. In addition, synagogues have rabbis who read the Torah in public. Often synagogues have schools for the study of the Torah and other important texts of that religion. These schools are for both young children and adults. The synagogue also serves as a kind of library for Jews, where every believer can borrow a book and read. Every Jewish man goes through a special strange ritual called circumcision. If you don't know what it is a surgical procedure where a man, though most often a very young child, has a piece of skin cut off his penis. If you want to know more about the procedure, you better Google it. Now, circumcision is a symbol of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. The word covenant in this case means a covenant. God and the Jewish people made a covenant that the Jews would worship only this God and keep his commandments. In return, God would make them God's chosen people, help them, and give them a land to live on. Circumcision is like a seal on the body, symbolizing the covenant between the Jews and God as a symbol of their faith and devotion to the Creator. Circumcision takes place on the 8th day of a boy's birth. Circumcision is usually performed by a special person called a mohel. Most often he is also a rabbi, that is, a Jewish religious teacher. Circumcision is done with a thin, sharp blade. Naturally, after the cutting off of the skin, that is, the foreskin of a young boy, it bleeds. So, for centuries, for thousands of years, a circumciser has cut off a boy's foreskin and then sucked the blood from the wound with his mouth. Then he would spit out the blood. Fortunately, in today's world, most often a special tube is used for this purpose. But there are also ultra-conservative sects of Jews, the Hasidic Meili, in which everything is still done in the old way with the mouth, so as not to break tradition. Circumcision is not only practiced by Jews, by the way, for example, in Islam. Circumcision is considered desirable but not obligatory. It is interesting that during the persecution of the Jews, including the Holocaust, some members of that religion underwent a painful surgical procedure of skin tightening, thus, in order to hide traces of circumcision. This was done so that no one would find out about their religion and faith, since Jews, as we know, have been persecuted, expelled, and killed throughout history. Such a procedure could often save their lives. According to biblical myth, God gave Moses tablets of stone, that is, tablets on which the 10 Commandments were carved. Later, these commandments and these tablets were placed in a wooden portable box with 2 statues of cherubim on the lid. This box was called the Ark of the Covenant and served as a symbol of the union between God and the Jews. This ark was carried ahead of the Jews as they wandered through the desert for 40 years after their liberation from Egypt. It was forbidden to look inside the ark, not even to touch it, for God punished it with death. In reality, though, of course, such a prohibition existed so that no one could know that no sacred artifacts were actually there. Later, this ark was installed in the Holy of Holies in the first temple in Jerusalem. This ark was no longer shown to the people at all at that time, and only the high priest could go there once a year. Unfortunately, the temple was eventually destroyed by the Babylonians, and the ark was lost. It is not known where it went. Many people, especially in the Middle Ages, tried to find it, as did the Holy Grail. According to myth, the Holy Grail is the cup from which Jesus Christ drank at the Last Supper. Neither the ark nor the play, of course, has ever been found. But here's the interesting thing. In Africa, in a country like Ethiopia, there are a lot of Christians, and they are Orthodox Christians. There are black priests there, and there is also a chapel in Ethiopia, where the Ark of the Covenant is supposedly kept. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church officially declares that the very sacred artifact of unprecedented power, which holds the very tablets of commandments, is in this little chapel. They say that supposedly the Ark was taken from Israel to Ethiopia a long time ago to save it from the evil Babylonians. Of course, like any other magical artifact, the Ark of the Covenant is hidden in this chapel from prying eyes, and the Ethiopian priests never show it to anyone. The chapel is well guarded, but despite this, Ethiopian Christians do believe it to be true. So, as you can see, nothing prevents you too from claiming that you have the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the Philosopher's Stone, and an alien mummy under your bed. It is very likely that someone will believe you too. If you go to any website about Judaism run by the Jews themselves, or buy any of their books, the word God will be spelled like this, with a dash in it. Here's the thing. There's a commandment in the Torah, according to which it's not allowed to erase the name of God, as well as to desecrate him. Well, that's why on paper and electronically the word God is sort of spelled incompletely, with a line through it. Because it can happen that a piece of paper or a book with the word God written on it is thrown into a trash bin, or God forbid, is used for more dirty purposes. And to prevent it, the word God is written with a line through it. Then even if someone erases this word or somehow defiles this paper, it will not be a violation of the commandment, because such a word is not full-fledged. By the way, it is also interesting that it is not known exactly how the personal name of God was pronounced in the Hebrew language. The fact is that the Torah was written in Hebrew, and they did not have class letters in their alphabet. You only agree reading these letters the ancient Jew simply knew for himself which vowel letters to add to the words while reading. That is why the name of God in the original Torah was written using 4 consonant letters. If we transcribe these letters into English, we get a word like this. It is impossible to tell exactly what the ancient Jews called the God, but it is commonly believed that the name reads Yahweh, which means the one who exists. Although for some time it was thought that the name was read as Jehovah, and members of the Jehovah's Witnesses sect still call their God by that name. In their translation of the Bible, all of God's names, including titles such as God and Lord or Master, are also replaced with Jehovah. There is a very important concept in Judaism, the Sabbath. It is the Sabbath when almost all kinds of work are strictly forbidden, according to biblical myth, when God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. For Jews, the Sabbath is the 7th day, just as it is for Christians. Therefore, on this day it is necessary to rest and turn all thoughts to God, to pray and to read the Torah. On this day it is possible and necessary, but there is a big list of kinds of work which it is impossible to do on Shabbat. These include, for example, slaughtering cattle, sifting flour, sowing, making and extinguishing fires, construction, skinning carcasses, shearing sheep, hunting, bleaching wool, and more. At the same time, there is no prohibition on pushing weights. That is, it is allowed to move furniture on Shabbat, but it is not allowed to press buttons, because pressing a button produces a microscopic spark, which is nothing else than making a fire, which is forbidden. In addition, it is forbidden even to ask non-Jews to do something that a Jew needs but cannot do because it is Shabbat. One can only hint at it. There is even such a thing as a no-goy, and that is a non-Jewish person who is specifically hired by Jews to do this or that work on Shabbat that Jews themselves cannot do. He could be a Christian, a Muslim, or a non-believer. Such a person comes to the house of the Jews on Shabbat, lights candles for them, cleans, feeds the animals, and does other necessary work. The most important Jewish pilgrimage site is the Wailing Wall. The fact is that the Jews, since receiving the Torah from God, have built only 2 temples. The first temple was built about 3,000 years ago by King Solomon. A few centuries later, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonian invaders. Later, another temple was built, but it too was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. As a result, only a wall called the Western Wall was left of the temple complex. It is also called the Western Wall. This name was given to it by the Arabs when Jerusalem was under their control. To be at this wall, Jews come and pray and weep because of the destruction of their temple. In today's world, numerous pilgrims come there. They count the Torah by the wall, pray, and some lightly bang their heads against the wall. People also leave notes that they slip between the stones of which the wall is made. They believe that the message on these notes goes directly to God. For those who cannot go to Jerusalem, there are special online services that allow anyone to write a message, which will then be printed on paper and inserted into the wall. The wall is unreal, so twice a year ravens, surnamed Rabinowitz, and his assistants collect all the notes accumulated during that time and bury them in the local Jewish cemetery. Reading other people's notes is strictly forbidden, but not everyone follows this prohibition. In 2008, Barack Obama came to Israel and came to the Wailing Wall to also put his note there. By the way, this is done not only by Jews, but also by representatives of other religions. Also, right after Obama left there, a young Jewish student came to the wall, pulled out a note, and sold it to a local newspaper. This newspaper published the contents of this note. It was nothing special, just the usual prayer in which Obama prays for himself and his family. You may ask why the Jews will not undertake to build their third temple just as they have built the 2 temples before. Seeing the money and opportunities are there, it is possible to build a third temple that will be bigger and better. In addition, building a third temple in Judaism is a very important thing for the Jewish people to accomplish. It is all about the prophecy contained in Scripture. According to it, at some point in the future, the Messiah will come to earth, who will unite the Jewish people and build the third temple. Jesus Christ, after all, was also originally a Jew and wanted to reform that religion. But in the end, he simply created his own. But he did not build the third temple, so he is not considered the Messiah by the Jews. After all, if he had been, he would have built the temple. The Jews generally consider Christianity a sect that has separated itself from their religion, just as many Orthodox and Catholics consider Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and countless other new Christian religious movements to be sects. In addition, the prophecy is quite detailed in describing what this third temple should look like. But many such details there are so unclear and contradictory that it is not clear how the building should be constructed. There is also no consensus among the rabbis as to whether or not we should start building the temple before the coming of the Messiah in advance. Some believe it is worthwhile, while others argue that the third temple in fact will not need to be built. It will miraculously appear on the Temple Mount itself. All that will be needed is to finish the final work in Israel. There are organizations that try to start the construction themselves, but they constantly encounter protests from ultra-Orthodox Jews. Most likely, the temple will never be built in the end, since someone will always protest against its construction, claiming that only the mission should do it. By the way, in the history of Judaism, there have already been many people who claim to be missionaries. Such people have even gathered a huge number of followers around them, but it must be understood that against any such mission, someone will always protest too and claim that he is not a real Messiah. Even if he comes and really starts doing miracles, there will still be those who will say that he is already a Messiah sent by the devil and endowed with devilish powers. Perhaps the most famous Messiah in Judaism was Shabtai Zvi, who lived in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. Of course, he didn't perform miracles, but he created a doctrine and gathered a bunch of followers around him who believed he was the one. It ended as follows. The Sultan, who was a Muslim, called Shabtai Zvi to him and told him that since he was the Messiah, he must be immortal, and offered him a test. The archers would shoot Shabtai with arrows, and if he survived, it meant he didn't sit down, and the Sultan would recognize that and bow down to him. There were also 2 other options offered to him. Simply accept Islam without hesitation. Shabtai Tzv accepted Islam and became a Muslim. I wonder why. But it didn't end there. Not all of his followers turned away from him after that. As I said before, One can interpret everything in religion in any way one wants. So the followers of Shabtai Zvi explained his conversion to Islam as follows. Being a true Messiah, he sacrificed the most precious thing he had. Not his life, because life is bullshit, but his faith. For what? For the sake of not killing people who would have tried to take revenge on the Sultan if he had killed Shabtai. But such a noble act, plus the fact that he still experienced the power of faith, impressed his disciples. They did not turn away from him. Their faith in Shabtai became even stronger, which meant that they were tested by doubts. Unlike many other religions, Jews do not do missionary work to convert members of other religions. If such work is done, it is only to bring secular, non-believing Jews back to religion. But in general, the number of Jews in the world is growing only because of the high birth rate. It is still possible to become a Jew among them, even if you are not a Jew. You have to go through a special ritual called conversion, including circumcision if you are a man. In order to accept Judaism, you will first have to go through a kind of trial by rabbis, who will consider whether you are really ready to become part of the Jewish people. Speaking of rabbis, many people think that a rabbi is the same as a priest only in Judaism, but that is not true. A rabbi is a religious degree awarded to those who are qualified to interpret the Torah. That is, rabbis are not priests, but teachers. Priests administer the sacrament. Rabbis teach in Judaism. The priests were originally called Kohen, and they performed services, sacrifices, and various rituals in the temple. But the temple, as you know, was destroyed, and the Kohen lost their functions. At the same time, only the descendants of a certain ancient lineage had access to them. An outsider could not become one. Now, however, they had no religious significance whatsoever. What is interesting is that modern genetics has confirmed that the modern Kohanim are indeed distant relatives of each other. This indicates that thousands of years ago they all had a common father. Judaism is the 10th largest religion in the world. There are now approximately 15 million Jews. Most of them live in the United States and Israel. Write in the comments if you believe in God and what your religion is. I read all the comments, and they also help a lot to promote the video. So write something to continue the theme. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. Be adequate and reasonable. This has been Dreamanis with you. Bye.